Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my review of Final Fantasy IV. Now, it's been a while since I made a video, but now I finished school, don't have a job, and I have all the free time in the world, so let's get started. First off, it's been a while since I played Final Fantasy IV, because it was a really short game, and I managed to beat it only in about 2 to 3 weeks, and that was about 2 months ago, I'd say. So I'm a little... It's not as fresh in my mind as I would want it to be, but that's okay, because the nice thing was it was a very memorable game for the most part. Story-wise, it was really good. I had a lot of really nice characters, and the game was really more story-focused than some of the previous Final Fantasy games. This one was a lot like 2, where the game focused more on the story and the character interaction than the actual gameplay. That's not to say the gameplay wasn't good, because overall the game was still pretty high quality in terms of combat, and characters still had pretty much all the basic functionality with magic and everything else that you would expect from a Final Fantasy game. But it was more story focused, like I said. So the characters themselves were all named characters, unlike some of the previous Final Fantasy where they were just named based on the class. These characters actually had names and backgrounds for each character. And one of the biggest things gameplay wise that was affected by that was that each character had a specific archetype, job class. So each character had a specific job that was tied to the story. So instead of being able to choose your job for each character character already had a specific job, and that played along throughout the story, and characters would evolve based on their class. So, for example, the main character, Cecil, starts off as a Dark Knight and has all the abilities you would expect from a Dark Knight in the Final Fantasy series. Later on, about halfway through the game, we come to find out the Dark Knight class is more evil, and it's more represented by evil, and it ends up being a hamperance to his quest, and he ends up becoming a paladin instead. So he ends up giving up his Dark Knight powers and becomes a paladin, which that is a change in the story that affects the gameplay. So he gains all the attributes of the paladin class while losing all the Dark Knight stuff. So his armor type changes. Instead of having like the Dark Knight armor that you've seen in previous Final Fantasies that would, be more focused towards combat and whatnot, the Paladin has a specific set of armor that actually he gets in the beginning is called Paladin armor, and leans more towards a knight style character throughout the game. And he gets, the more holy white swords versus like dark blades. He gets more like paladin-ish weapons. You get like Excalibur and a lot of the weapons you would expect a good character to wield, as well as the ability to have some basic healing, which is characteristic of a paladin anyway. So things like that. None of the other characters really change classes per se as much as Cecil did, but Rydia, the black magic / summoner character, goes through a transitional stage during the game and becomes more summoner-esque and loses some of her dark magic and really powers up, gets a higher level summoning abilities. So that's kind of how the gameplay goes for the game. Magic isn't bought in stores like it has been in previous Final Fantasies. You actually acquire them by leveling and during certain parts of the story. You'll come across a specific boss who will grant you a specific ability. kind of like when you defeat a summon, you get the ability to use that summon. So overall, the gameplay, the gameplay might be a little bit linear, but not in a negative sense. It is really. They still give you a freedom to move around the world. You still have the world map, and at some point, of course, you get chocobos to ride around on and airships to fly with, and you can traverse the world pretty much in any manner in which you would normally do in a Final Fantasy. It's pretty open world. There's a specific path, obviously, story-wise, that you would follow, and there's multiple worlds that you travel to. You have the main world, and you have like an underground level, and then you also have a moon excursion at some point. And so obviously when you move between levels, it's initially you get stranded in those specific levels and you can't go back to the main overworld initially, but you do traverse back and forth between all three lands over time, and the game is pretty open world. So overall it's not ultra linear. Overall the story is fantastic. You have a huge group of characters that you get throughout the story. They sort of come in and out of your party randomly for the most part. Your main character is Cecil, and he stays throughout the game as your main character, per se. And he's always in your party. And then you have characters like Rosa, which is your healer, and then Kane is a dragoon, and just a handful of other characters that all come in and out of the party. I think in general, Cecil's probably the only one who stays permanently there. But a lot of them, it's kind of odd. A lot of them kind of move in and out, but there's a small core group that is there for, I would say, about 75% of the time. But you would always have a basic. The game is pretty balanced in the fact where your party is never going to be overly without a healer or without, the hard-hitting warrior types or a magic type. You'll always have a pretty balanced party no matter what piece of the story you're in, no matter who is in your party at that specific time. So overall, the game is really awesome like that. The game has been released for pretty much every system imaginable, just like Final Fantasy III was. I've got a list here. It initially came out on Super Nintendo. It was re-released on the PlayStation as a port in a bundle with Chrono Trigger in the US, known as the Final Fantasy Chronicles. It was also released on the Game Boy Advanced. It was released on the DS, which is one of the versions I bought. I actually ended up playing it on the Super Nintendo, so I managed to grab a copy of that. And then it was also released on PSP. What else we got here? It was released on iOS and Android at some point a few years back, and then last year it came out on Steam. So overall, no matter what platform you have, you can pick this game up. Throughout the initial re-releases, they've altered the game to a tad. They sort of updated the game with characters having more abilities, and the classes are a little bit more geared towards modern day Final Fantasy games versus the way they were in the initial handful of games. So if you pick up the DS release or the PSP or iOS or any of those newer versions, they have a lot more features, which are actually supposed to be a lot nicer and make the game a little bit better to play. Not necessarily easier, but just they give you more options. I've heard that the PSP version is the most difficult for some reason. Apparently the way they've been tweaking it between each version. The DS version is not as difficult as the PSP version, which I'm not sure why that is. But overall, I mean, I played the game on the Super Nintendo, the original, the way it was initially released, and I really enjoyed it. And it was short. I think it only took me about 20 hours, which is not bad for an RPG, especially an old one like that. I mean, it's not as long as like 3 was. Even 2 was a little bit longer than that. But you got to remember that the game was initially released on the Super Nintendo, and they still only had so many megabytes of RAM and storage capacity, where probably fitting in all of those graphical upgrades from the NES and just all the extra features that they put into the game probably really was stressful on such an old system. And so 20 hours was probably plenty. They probably couldn't squeeze any more onto a cartridge at that level. Final Fantasy V and VI were both also released on Super Nintendo in Japan. 5 didn't come out here until much later, but that's a whole nother story. And then 6 was released as 3. And that's the other thing. Final Fantasy IV was released in the US as Final Fantasy II because Final Fantasy II and 3 were never initially released in the US. And so they didn't want it to be a confusion for US gamers playing the original game and then moving on and playing 4. They were worried people would wonder what happened to 2 and 3, and so they just renamed it 2. So that confuses a lot of people still to this day, and just know that if you buy it, any of the newer versions, like DS or PSP or whatever, it's still called Final Fantasy. It's called Final Fantasy IV, so don't be confused by that. They've straightened it all out, and the old numbering system, the old confusing 2 and 3, were actually 4 and 6 only apply if you play the cartridges, so hopefully that's not too confusing for you. Let's see, other than that, the game, difficulty-wise, wasn't too bad. I would say it's just right. It was right in that level of pretty easy for the most part. You'd have some boss battles that were a little bit more difficult than others. The end game, I would say, was pretty difficult. Another one of those dungeons, they always draw it out right at the end of Final Fantasy. They always make it really difficult. Towards the end, they always have like a long dungeon. Luckily, though, in 4, there was a lot more areas where you could save, so it wasn't as difficult as 3 was. Overall, the game was fantastic. Story-wise, gameplay was pretty solid as well. And overall, I'd have to say it's one of the better Final Fantasies of the older generation. Many people regard Final Fantasy IV as their favorite Final Fantasy of all time, and I would have to say it is a very good game. So if you are interested in playing it all, I'd definitely pick it up at some point in some variation, whatever system you want to play it on. I would recommend it. Thanks for watching, guys, and I hope to make a whole lot more videos in the coming weeks. I have a lot of plans for videos for the next couple days and stuff planned out, so hopefully I can hammer those out. My video editing software had a huge update. They completely revamped it, so it's going to take me some time to get used to the new version. But as soon as I get everything put together, I'm going to put this video out, and I've got a couple more videos I'm going to make as fast as I can and hopefully get them out to you. So stay tuned, and thanks for watching.